The aftermath of the battle was quiet, almost eerily so. The battlefield was littered with the twisted remnants of Krekar mechs and their fallen infantry strewn across the now smoking wasteland. New Eden's defenses, though hastily constructed and poorly designed, had held. The rebels, the humans, had emerged victorious. He'd been part of countless battles, fought alongside the deadliest warriors the galaxy had ever known, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Syndicate mercenaries were still recovering, their battle-hardened soldiers staggering and regrouping after the brutal fighting. They had done their part, yes, but it had been the humans who had made the decisive blows. The weird, unpredictable, chaotic human tactics had utterly crushed that gone. And even now, as you growing me, wow, okay, dog. Varkok stood still, his helmet in his hands, his mind racing. He had seen his own men at their best, the finest mercenaries in the galaxy, but now the galaxy's most feared warriors felt like a shadow of their farthest selves. They had been outclassed, outwitted by a particular rag career with no big fate, Diaz or Silver. How did they do it? He muttered under his breath. The question gnawed at him, refusing to go unanswered. "Commander, you should see this," came the voice of Rook from behind him, his tone tense. Varkok turned, his eyes narrowing as the alien approached, his face set in grim lines. There was a flicker of unease in his sharp eye. "What is it, Rook?" "We're receiving a communication from the Krachar," Rook said, gesturing to the data screen that had flickered to life beside them. The hologram of the Krachar general appeared as in sector cutting short Yojani. "Patch it through," he said. The image of the Krachar general flickered, his multiple eyes narrowing as his mandibles clicked in what could have become a form of speech. "Varkok Untitled Syndicate Mercenaries." Vise stood so tall, but the knot in his stomach tightened. "General Zolk." "You," Axelkor said with venom in his voice, "you betrayed us." Varkok's brow furrowed. "Betrayed? I hired you, General, to help with the Krechar's conquest. You failed, miserably." The Krechar general hissed, his mandibles clicking again. Varkon's mind was racing. "What are you talking about?" "You should have seen it," Elcor continued, his voice low, almost growling. "They fought in ways that defied all logic, all order. No strategy, no honor. They mocked us. They mocked me. My forces had never been humiliated like of his assailant," showing aromatic fluid spattered on his dress clothing. "Happily." The Krabrig general's eyes fled with that. Varkok took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Cock General Largan." "No." Itog's voice grew on and chickle. "May I have everybody smile when you just say things that shrill?" "So I didn't catch you." She smiled as she always smiled at euphoric women should. The Krikar general's hologram flickered, and with one final hiss, the transmission was cut. Silence mode. Rook spoke again, his voice thick with doubt. "What now, Commander?" Vargren stared at the empty space where the Kreha general's hologram had stood. "Now," he said slowly, "we salvage what we can, and we leave Breba." Rock blinks, confusion on his face. "Leave? But we've—" "No, we haven't," Varkok muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Back on the surface, the humans were celebrating their victory with a kind of energy that only a species like theirs could muster. As Varkok and Rook walked through the camp, the sounds of cheering and laughter echoed in the air, mingling with the smell of food and the crackle of bonfires. There was no sense of respect for the gravity of what we should have left before it came to this, Varkok muttered, his eyes scanning the scene. One group of humans dressed in mismatched armor was reenacting the battle, acting out exaggerated versions and Captain Klein spotted him from across the camp, and she waved energetically, striding toward him with a wide grin on her face. "You made it," she said brightly. "I was wondering when you'd show up. Celebrate with us, Varkok. You're not going to sulk on the sidelines, are you?" Varkok stared at her, disbelief written across his face. "Celebrate after what just happened? Your people just made a mockery of everything I've ever fought for. You're made up to me." Heine's smile never wavered. "I get it. You syndicate guys don't really know how to have fun." Varkok didn't know whether to scream or laugh. "You don't understand." Hein raised an eyebrow, still holding that ridiculous smile. "Weak? Please don't tell me you're upset about a little thing like reputation. You're alive, right? We're alive. We won. That's all that matters." Varkok's fists clenched. "You've humiliated us." "You want to know?" Neek replied as they drank beer together and exchanged ideas looking a while. "And you'll learn to live this way." Varkok stood there, speechless, watching as Klein walked away. The woman was impossible. He had spent his entire life learning the art of war, understanding the rules of combat, the intricacies of strategy, and yet here was a species that fought with madness, and somehow they had won. Somehow the humans had taken everything that he and the Syndicate stood for and turned it into nothing more than a farce. As the laughter and cheers continued around him, Varkok realized one final fight. They had become the galaxy's new root. The day of the battle against the Krikar Dominion had finally arrived. As Varkok watched from the command center, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The humans weren't acting like soldiers, they were acting like civilians, with a sense of chaos that only a people who'd never seen more chance. "We've been trained to fight like the Syndicate," Varkok muttered to himself, "but they act like they've never heard of basic military doctrine." Beside him, Lieutenant of Rook, a towering Zillion warrior with jagged red scars across his face, was frowning. "Commander, I do not understand. They don't take anything seriously. There's no structure in their movements. How would the understand you get caught?" Varkok didn't have an answer. His mind was racing, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The humans had only been trained by the Syndicate for a few weeks, and even then they seemed to care little for the rules that governed the art of war. Their movements were disjointed, their weaponry often mismatched, and their strategies seemed absurd. Nothing like the calculated plans that be out to execute each time. And they didn't march in lines, nor did they respond to orders like his elite soldiers would. Instead, they were having fun, laughing, joking, making absurd bets on which side you would. But Varkok's orders were clear. Protect New Eden. Wipe out the Krekar's threat, which was a Syndicate's job to make sure their clients' white wishing were fulfilled. The countdown battle began, and the human rebels were preparing for the worst. They had deployed crude, homemade barricades along the city's perimeter, reinforced with some of the weapons Varkok. In one corner of the camp, a group of them were fiddling with a strange device that looked like it might explode in their faces, while others were mixing chemicals in barrels, creating what they called custom explosives. Varkok didn't even know how to respond. These weren't soldiers. They weren't even military-grade civilians. They were a joke. But a joke with an entire colony riding on its success. The Krekar fleet appeared on the horizon, just as the humans took their positions. It was a massive armada, hundreds of ships, each one a brutal masterpiece of war bearing down on New Eden. The Krekar had come for their conquest. Their numbers were overwhelming, their firepower immense, and their generals ruthless. But these humans, beside their laughable appearance, were not going to back down. Vorcroft felt a strange knot in his stomach tighten. He could almost hear Klein's mocking words echoing in his mind. "We don't play The first wave of Krehar ships began to descend, unleashing hell on the human positions. Their weapons tore through the atmosphere, sending shockwaves that rattled the ground. Volko Syndicate soldiers with precision, returning fire with their advanced weapons. Believers, they had something completely unexpected. Instead of fighting like any normal resistance force, they scattered. The human soldiers dove for cover, rolling into ditches, ducking behind the makeshift barricades, and even ducking under the wreckage of their own structures. And then started firing. But what Kovarkov barred wasn't the way they fought. It wasn't even their tenacity. They had their weapons, sure, but their biggest asset was their willingness to embrace the chaos. While the Syndicate moved with deadly precision, the humans made noise, shouting, taunting the Krigar, even as their shots flew wide. But they didn't miss. They hit things when they least expected. Varkik watched, dumbfounded, as one human, barely a teenager, stood up in the middle of the open, aimed a crude grenade launcher, and fired a round into the sky. Down. The explosion was so big and rattled. Varkik stood trying in every direction, and the boy laughed hysterically. Spit. How is this possible? Vark muttered, his mind struggling to process what he must. They're insane, Rug said. They're not afraid to die. No, Verkok replied, his eyes narrowing. They're too confident. There's something else here. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the Krakar were completely unprepared for this kind of fighting. They had never encountered a bit of force like the humans before. At one point, Varkok's flagship was hit by an enemy missile. His ship was equipped with the best shielding money could buy, but even so, the impact rattled the vessel. Varkok's soldiers scrambled to assess the damage, while he remained rooted to his spot, his eyes still locked on the unfolding chaos below. The humans, in a moment of complete absurdity, had done the unthinkable. The Syndicate soldiers quickly adapted, following the humans' lead, but they were still trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The humans didn't operate by the usual laws of warfare. They didn't respond to fear. Instead, they embraced it. They lived on it. They didn't have the same discipline that Varkok had spent his whole life respecting, but they had something else, something far more dangerous. They had been. They're making a joke of us, Varkok muttered under his breath, watching a group of humans throw themselves at a Krykar-heavy tank, wrapping it in some kind of makeshift explosive device. The tank exploded, and instead of running for cover, the humans cheered. They were celebrating their success like they were playing a game. At the same time, a group of Krekahar infantry tried to advance toward one of the human positions, only to be met with a barrage of what could only be described as Jack weaponry. It was cobbled together from anything the humans could find, ranged from crude laser guns to modified. Varkok stood still, watching the strange, chaotic battlefield unfold. He realized something that he'd never expected. These humans were winning, not because they were better soldiers, not because they had better weapons. They fought with madness. A sense of dread began to seep into his thoughts. It was subtle at first, just a crack in his confidence. But the more he watched, then came the turning point. A group of Krakar heavy mechs stomped through the battlefield, their massive forms crushing anything in their path. But the humans weren't done yet. Klein, the human leader, stood tall at the front of her troops, a wild grin on her face. She was holding a device that Varkok had never seen before. It wasn't a weapon. It was more like a massive electrical generator. She smiled as she pulled the trigger, and suddenly the Krakar mechs stopped dead in their tracks, their systems frying from the shock. The humans rushed in, finishing the job. And that's what it hit him. The humans weren't playing by any rule book. They had no fear, no logic, no plan beyond making the battle their own. And that made them dead. As the Trek forces retreated in disarray, Vork stood motionless, staring at the battlefield. The galaxy had always been a battleground. Endless wars, blood-soaked territories, and empires that rose and fell as quickly as stars died. Mercenaries were the galaxy's true power brokers, hired guns for hire in a universe that demanded strength, ruthlessness, and no room for weakness. They had earned their name through decades of blood and fire. With their leader, Varkok the Untouchable, at the helm, the Syndicate had been the galaxy's most formidable force. Entire planetary systems had fallen at their feet. Their once proud flint armor shook the weight of planetary firepower. When they entered a battlefield, victory was guaranteed and the enemy's fate was sealed. For years, the galaxy had learned to avoid the Syndicate. Wars could be fought with diplomacy and politics, but when the Syndicate was hired, the rules of engagement were rewritten. When the human colony New Eden found itself facing the overwhelming might of the Krykar Dominion, a brutal alien empire bent on the Syndicate, intrigued by this human desperation, sent their best, a fleet of battle-hardened ships led by none other than Varkok himself. The humans had not requested a small force, not a consultation or a show of strength. They wanted the full might of the Syndicate's most experienced soldiers. Their need was desperate, and the Syndicate, always quick to seize an opportunity, agreed. When the Syndicate arrived in orbit over New Eden, they expected to find a thriving colony, one that at least had the means to put up a decent fight against the Krykar. Hitchcock stood at the helm of his flagship, the Still Revan, as it drifted above the atmosphere. The sensors were buzzing with readings of what seemed to be a poorly constructed, haphazard base. This wasn't the kind of place where any significant force could have been assembled. It wasn't a well-fortified military destroyer. "Commander, I don't understand," said one of his lieutenants, a grizzled alien with a deep scar running across his face. "Where are the soldiers? This place is a mess." Varkok's eyes narrowed as he studied the planet below, his gaze a cold, calculating thing. "There's no fleet here," he muttered. "No reason." When the shuttle carrying Varkok and his elite mercenaries descended to the surface of New Eden, they were greeted by a group of ragtag human rebels. They didn't look like soldiers. Hell, they didn't even look like they'd ever seen a war. There were no uniforms, no disciplined ranks, just a loose group of people, some of whom were wearing mismatched armor patched up as the weapons they held were an eclectic mix. And leading them was Captain Emma Klein, a woman whose presence seemed to defy everything Varkok knew about military hierarchies. She was standing tall, all hands on her hips, with the grin on her face that seemed as out of place as the rest of their spectacle. If Varkok had to guess, she was about 25 years old, and yet there was a certain audacity to her demeanor. She didn't seem impressed by the mercenaries' imposing presence in their armor and weapons. She didn't flinch at Varkok's towering figure as he approached. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and gave him a look that could only be described as, "Welcome to New Eden, mercenary," Captain Klein said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Glad you could join us. It's so rare we get visitors of your caliber." Varkok blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her tone. She wasn't even remotely intimidated by him or his reputation. He glanced at his lieutenants, who seemed just as confused as he was. "I was promised an army," Varkok looking back in line. "This is not an..." Klein just smirked. "You want an army, Varkok? You'll get one. But we don't play by your rules." She motioned toward the small. For a moment there was silence. Varkok stood there, unsure whether to take her seriously or not. Finally he spoke. "I'm not here to settle. I'm here to win. The Krykar are coming, and they are not going to care about your improvised military." "We'll see about that," The reporter responded with a wink. "We've got more trick up our sleeves than you could." Vorkok's patience was wearing thin, but he had no choice but to follow her. His orders were clear. The Syndicate would provide whatever assistance New Eden needed, and if the humans weren't up to the task, well. But as he followed Klein through the base, he couldn't help but notice the strange energy among the humans. They were talking, laughing, and at one point a human soldier, no older than 18 by the looks of him, approached one of the Syndicate's more seasoned warriors. The human had an oversized energy rifle slung across his back, and he was grinning ear to ear. "Think you could teach me how to use that thing?" the human asked, gesturing to the Syndicate soldier's advanced weapon. "I mean, I know how to shoot, but yours looks way cooler than mine." The Syndicate soldier, clearly taken aback, narrowed his eyes. "You want me to teach you how to fight? With death?" "You?" he shrugged. "Hey, if you've got time, I'd appreciate it. If not, no worries, because you're a bit old for this kind of thing anyway." He laughed, clearly oblivious to the fact that he was talking to one of the Deadliest Mercenaries in the galaxy. The Syndicate soldier was about to say something, but Vorkok stepped in, his voice low and menacing. "Enough! Get to your positions. We're not here to entertain ourselves." But as Vorkok looked around, something unusual happened. The humans weren't scared of him. They weren't scared of anything, even in the face of certain death. Their humor never faltered. It was like they had no concept. It was the real problem, and that. Over the next few days, the Syndicate trained the humans in the ways of war. They taught them how to fight like mercenaries, how to use the advanced weaponry and technology that the Syndicate had mastered over the centuries, but the humans were difficult students that weren't meant. Instead, they questioned everything, laughed at things that should have been taken seriously, and often veered off course during drill. During a simulated battle against a mock Krayhar unit, the humans refused to stick to the stratagems laid out by the Syndicate. Instead, they used the terrain they made. By the time the real battle against the Conqueror arrived, Vorkok was beyond frustrated. The human forces were still far from prepared by Syndicate standards. As the Syndicate mercenaries marched alongside the humans to meet the Krayhar, they learned the most terrifying truth of all. And as Vorkok's elite mercenaries followed them into the fray, they quickly realized that the human approach to war might be chaotic, unpredictable, and downright absurd. The Krayhar, despite all their strength and might, were about to learn the hardest lesson of all: never underestimate the human.